All right, well, we'll kick it off here. Excuse me. Well, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Hauge. I'm the Executive Director of Homeline, and you're joining us today on Wednesday, February 24th at 1:30 in the afternoon for another one of Homeline's regular webinars highlighting issues in Minnesota tenant landlord law during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've got some guest speakers today, and we've got questions submitted in advance, lots to cover. So I'm just going to go through a few logistical things, and then we'll get started. Just a reminder about what Homeline is for any folks that are new joining us today. We're a statewide nonprofit organization. Our main program is a free and confidential legal hotline that any renter in the state can contact and get advice about their individual situation, rental housing situation. And folks can reach us in multiple languages, English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong languages. And there's our contact information, our hotline, toll-free number, and language lines, as well as where you can reach us on our website. Just a reminder, we've been doing these seminars since about mid-April of 2020, after the eviction suspension went into effect in March, and have covered that quite a bit, but other COVID-19 related rental housing issues and other new topics, current topics in tenant landlord law. So you can reach our website at homelinemn.org, and there's a COVID-19 tab where a lot of materials are, resources, FAQs, as well as links to previous recordings, and registration for our next seminar, which I will put a link in the chat to. 2 weeks from today, on March 10th, again in the afternoon, we're going to be joined by Margaret Kaplan, who's the president of the Housing Justice Center. There's a new set of tenant protection ordinances that were passed in 2020, in the summer of 2020, and they go into effect on March 1st. So just about a week away or so. So we're going to have Margaret on to discuss those ordinances. Margaret's been a part of the implementation committee in St. Paul that has been preparing for those ordinances to start on March 1st. So we'll be discussing those. We'll also talk about any updates with the suspension at that point as well. Okay. Before we hand it over to Michael here, just a couple logistics. We did get a question about CLE credit. We have applied in the past for some of these seminars for continuing legal education credit for attorneys. We're not doing that for today. It's not the focus of our webinar today, but a couple of the previous sessions we did apply for CLE credit. The logistics for today is that Michael, Homeline's Public Policy Director, is going to introduce our guest speakers briefly. And then we're going to quickly jump over to Homeline's Managing Attorney and Hotline Director, Mike Vrau, for a very brief overview, like we've done on every session, about what the current status of the eviction suspension is, just because we did get some questions in advance about that. But then after Mike is done, then we'll jump back and give a chance for our legislative guest speakers to share about their priorities for this session, especially as it relates to COVID-19 and rental housing issues. And we'd really love to have folks submit questions. We did get a number of questions submitted in advance, and so we'll start with those. There's some legal questions that maybe me or Mike will field, and we'll maybe save some of the legal questions for the end. We'd really like to prioritize any questions that participants have for the legislators about legislative session this year, about housing issues at the Capitol. And so you can do that. We do have some in advance, so we'll get to those first, and then please submit your questions via the question and answer Q&A system over Zoom, and we'll get to those later in the session, and also tackle some of the legal questions a little bit after that. The last thing I think I wanted to just share before I hand it over to Michael is just to provide a little context for who is on this webinar. Again, we've been doing these since about mid-April. Originally, we had multiple sessions with kind of targeted audiences, tenants separately from landlords. And then we combine the sessions, and we have a really, I think, broad mix of housing stakeholders really throughout the state. We have tenants, we have landlords, we have attorneys for tenants and landlords. We have a lot of social service agencies and providers and housing, number of different types of housing providers, folks from the courts and folks from state agencies. And so really a good mixture of housing stakeholders. So we're hoping that in hearing some of the questions that people have, both legal questions, but also specifically on priorities at the legislature, that will provide some context for what's important this year at the Capitol. So with that, I will hand it over to Michael Dahl, Homeland's Public Policy Director.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm going to be extremely brief here because I want to get to Mike's update on things. And I would love it if Representative Hausman and Representative Tice actually provide more of their own introduction about who they are, the area they represent, and as well as the key issues that they see addressing and reasons that they're interested in working on housing issues. I'll just say I'm really pleased that both of them are here with us today. And just to note that Representative Hausman is the chair of the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee, and serving with her as the lead Republican on the committee is Representative Tamma Tice. I've had the fortune of working with both of them for the past few years on rental housing issues as my time at Homeline, and it's been great to try to work out what it is we can get out of committee that are advances in tenant landlord law. And so I'm very pleased to have them both here, but I'm going to leave the introduction time for them so that they really can set the context for why housing issues matter to them. And just lastly, I'll say is I'll be the Q&A guy, asking questions that have been submitted in advance. At times when I need a save, Mike Varah will come in and do that for me, just to make sure we have all our bases covered, because some of the questions may have both political and legal aspects to them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike for a brief rundown on the current eviction suspension status.
Thanks, Michael. Right, so I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking today about, as far as evictions go in Minnesota, what is. Not what could be, not will be, but where we are right now. And where we are right now is, oh, yikes, I realized that we don't have the right date on there. Oh, well, I'll correct that with words. The governor's moratorium on evictions, which is tied in time to the peacetime emergency, has been extended through March 15th of 2021. That peacetime emergency has been extended 11 times now, which started back in March of last year. So we're closing in on the 1-year anniversary of the no evictions in Minnesota moratorium. How we've analyzed this since April of last year when we started doing this speech is what hurdles does a landlord have to get over in order to be able to file a non-payment of rent eviction? There are some exceptions built into the governor's eviction moratorium, but historically in Minnesota, evictions are filed for non-payment of rent. Almost every one of them, well over 90%, are for non-payment of rent. And so that's what we've focused on because that's such a huge impact on the landlord-tenant community. So right now, can a landlord file an eviction in Minnesota for non-payment of rent? Short answer, no, they can't. They have 2 hurdles to get past that are active hurdles and one that's a little more passive. The active hurdles are on the screen. The Minnesota moratorium is the first one. It goes through March 15th, as mentioned. Can that be extended? Yes. The governor could extend it for another 30 days if the governor chooses to, by extending the peacetime emergency for another 30 days. The Minnesota legislature could end the peacetime emergency declaration, which isn't just about housing, obviously. It's about all those other things that we see the governor issuing executive orders on, whether schools can be open or closed, bars, salons, churches, things like that. How many people can go see the Twins games is in the news these days too. The peacetime emergency goes on 30 days at a time, and the governor could stop the renewals by just not renewing again, or the legislature could stop the peacetime emergency executive order as well. However, that would require both chambers of the Minnesota legislature to vote by a simple majority in each chamber to end the peacetime emergency. And so far that hasn't happened. In the Senate, It's happened several times where the Republican-controlled Senate has voted to end the peacetime emergency. The Democrat-controlled House has not, which is why we're still having renewal after renewal of the peacetime emergency. It also could end, the eviction moratorium could end if the governor and or the legislature working together decided to end the eviction moratorium separate from the peacetime emergency, which is possible. The eviction moratorium is not something that has to exist, but it has coexisted with the peacetime emergency and has been tied, as mentioned, in time to the peacetime emergency since March of last year. But that's our first hurdle for a landlord that wants to file a non-payment of rent eviction. Let's say the Minnesota moratorium went away though tomorrow. The legislature voted to end it, or the governor just decided to end it on his own. Would a landlord be able to file a non-payment of rent eviction at that point? Well, not really, because we have a federal eviction moratorium as well. There are some requirements that a tenant has to assert in a declaration that they're under a certain income level, which is about $100,000 per adult, and that they've done everything they could to try to come up with the money to pay their rent. But as long as they do that, a landlord can't file an eviction against a tenant throughout the United States for non-payment of rent, at least through March 31. Now, that is hinged on an executive order routed through the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. It does not have a legislative stamp of approval. That particular extension through March 31 was simply ultimately an executive order from the president through the CDC. Now, President Biden has asked at the federal congressional level to have this moratorium extended through September of this year. That has not happened yet. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Additionally, maybe President Biden would simply extend it on his own if the US Senate and House don't extend it there. So the question about when a landlord will be able to file an eviction for non-payment of rent is, at present, they really can't, not in Minnesota. When will they be able to? We're not sure. Probably the best conservative guess would be April 1, no sooner than April 1, meaningfully. But probably a better guess is sometime in the fall, is a reasonable guess based on every signal that we're getting at the federal level and through the state level. But as mentioned, we wanted to keep this brief because we are focusing today not simply on what is the law, but we have legislators, active legislators that are able to decide what will be the law. So that's what we're hoping to get questions on throughout the rest of the day. And I'm going to yield the rest of the time back to Michael and our representative guests.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Earlier today, Mike was talking about how he is the person who talks about how things are, and he noted that Representative Hausman and Representative Tice get to be the people of what should be. And so we're hoping that people ask the questions about what should be for both of them to answer. And as I said, I wanted to give them a chance to answer a question about who their introduction and their interest in housing issues. And I get to play the role of chair this time. So Representative Hausman and Representative Tice, I'm going to give you 2 to 3 minutes each, if you could, to describe who you are and your interest in housing. And we'll start with Representative Hausman. I'll try to sort of go back and forth with who starts with what question, back and forth, but we'll give Representative Hausman, as chair of the committee, the first chance to describe her work.
So I live in St. Paul, represent a couple of neighborhoods in St. Paul, but mostly suburbs, the cities of Falcon Heights, Lauderdale, and most of Roseville. If you've been to the state fair, you've been in my district. So that is that grounds me geographically. What motivates me around housing? I guess it's that one sentence that I repeat all the time: nothing else in life goes well if you don't have a safe place to sleep at night. And there are 2 stories I tell. One is the University of Minnesota research that by the time a child reaches 5th grade, if they've been homeless or highly mobile, they're achieving at the level of a 2nd grader who's been in stable housing. The impact of housing instability on a child's ability to learn. And we know all of the other issues that come from that. And so there is motivation. But the other is a story. When you are involved in housing, you're invited to a lot of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings, and you hear the resident story. And at Pryor Crossing in the Midway area, which serves young people, a young woman told her story. And before she lived at Pryor Crossing, she had probably been living on the street or on the bus or on a friend's couch. And then she told us what it's like to suddenly have a room that has a door with a lock and she has the key. That transforming time. And of course, as soon as she has that stability, she wants to get on with all of the other things in life, whether it's education or finding a job, and there are supportive services to do that. So those are motivations, I guess. By the way, my introduction to housing didn't come about by chairing the housing committee, because for many years we didn't have a housing committee. It came when I was chairing capital investment, where we did, among other things, general obligation bonding for public housing and housing infrastructure bonds, where we partner with nonprofits. So that was really my first introduction to the work in housing.
Thank you, Representative Hausman, and now we'll turn it over to Representative Tice.
Thank you. It's always good to hear Chair Hausman talk about how she got into it, because I love the stories. My husband and I had owned a building and remodeling company for 30 plus years. We both were presidents of our local Home Builders Association, always very active in that. We closed the company in 2013 because of just hardship going through the recession, and then started home inspections. So, and a little bit different leadway, we're still kind of in the building industry. We also have 5 properties at this time, single family homes. At one time we had up to 13, with one of them being a duplex. So something I've always been very, very involved with in the housing industry, and knowing some of the things that are happening with the housing industry. And I really hope that we can come to some agreements with why housing costs so much more in Minnesota than it does in the surrounding states. It's a hard one to get to, because nobody wants to basically say, well, it's my fault. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for ways that we can cut some of the costs so that we can build some housing that is affordable. It's really getting to be hard to do in this time and age. When we have interest rates so low right now, lumber prices are quite expensive. And that's typically how it goes. When lumber is cheaper, then interest rates are a little bit higher. But what we've heard over and over again from different sources is that if housing isn't doing well, the economy isn't doing as well either. So I think there's a lot of benefits that we can hit. I would say that in greater St. Cloud area, we have a lot more workforce housing issues. We have the university, we have different manufacturing plants, jobs available. We have folks that are just looking for market value homes. And so we see a little bit difference. While we do try to address the homeless, and we do, we also have a lot of need for just homes. And that is where I probably come in a little bit more. In being in the St. Cloud area, I have the west and south part of St. Cloud, Wake Park, St. Augusta. But what you'll hear in a lot of greater Minnesota is we need a lot more of the workforce housing. We need to find the affordable options. We're looking at manufactured homes, and how do we make that work for everybody? So the needs are a little bit different. We do have issues with homeless, trying to find places, but I think our greater need some days is what we need to find for market value housing. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. And again, thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm going to note that affordability issues are issues that Homeline is definitely interested in. And we work in coalition with the Homes for All Coalition to do things like increase production of affordable housing and housing of different levels of support for people who need those. But most of our work actually has to do with what keeps people stably housed in a rental situation. And so I want to ask the question that I actually sent out in advance of this. And I would just want to ask you each what you think are the goals and roles of the state and federal government in keeping renters stably housed throughout the pandemic. And we'll start with Representative Theis here.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to say it many, many times. I think the best way that we help everybody is to get a really good relationship between our landlords and our tenants. We need to find that balance where we're not really holding one or the other a little bit more accountable for what's happening. I think we need to have better partnerships. We need to work at making sure that we have avenues and that there's some discussion to talk things out. And I would say that with my husband and I, and that is exactly how we deal with it. We're very upfront with our tenants that we want to know what's going on. If you're having some issues, let us know. We'll work through them. We'll find a way to do it. And I think that works for a lot of different areas. I know it doesn't always work that way. We see some folks who really shouldn't be, doing either one of the jobs, and they just don't do them very well. And so we need to figure out what is a balance where we can have that communication and figure out how do we keep people in their spots? How do we do it to the best of the abilities of everybody? And that means a nice working relationship. And that's always my biggest thing is we need a really good working relationship.
Representative Theis, that definitely the individual relationships are important. Can I ask if you do have a sense of if and what the state and federal government roles should be in this arena to protect renters, or is it an individual, you see it on the individual level?
I see it on an individual level, but I think that also works in making sure, what I should say is that I also want to make sure that we do have the monies available that keep people in homes, whether it's owning their own homes or if it is a rental situation. I just think there's so many values to, as Chair Hausman said, kids that are in homes do so much better. And I think that's a good indication of just the whole family unit. That is always first and foremost for me as well. But I think we have a lot of work to do. And I think we need to use the federal dollars in conjunction with state dollars and making sure that we're finding ways for folks to have the opportunities to not only rent, but also to own. And I like some of the bills that are coming through regarding manufactured homes. I think that's a really good place to start too.
Okay, thank you. Representative Hausman.
Right at the start of the pandemic, the first wave of people who lost their jobs because the bars and restaurants closed and retail closed were the workers who were working there. And we know enough about their salary levels to know that's a group that is probably one paycheck away from not being able to pay their bills. So the governor very quickly realized he didn't want any more homeless people at the time of a pandemic. And the eviction moratorium happened quickly. That's where the partnership then between the state and federal government kicked in. Thankfully, the federal government provided some money directly to states for housing assistance, rental assistance. And the state had to very quickly ramp up a system to get that money out to where it needed to be. Our goal at that point was to protect both renters and landlords. We wanted that housing to be available. We wanted it to be safe. And so the way we set it up in the House was that we would have money going directly to landlords so that we assured that they were continuing to be able to pay their bills, their utilities, etc. We did understand, though, that at a certain point, this eviction moratorium will end. And then that group of people is potentially, if they get behind on their bills, they're clearly not going to be able to deal with deep debt when they can't even pay their monthly bills. So we're right now thinking through what is our state responsibility? What's the off-ramp for the eviction moratorium? So that's the piece we're sort of working through, and that has to be clear before the end of the session. So state and federal working together. Federal provides a lot of money during this time. The state administers, and so that it required both state and federal government to be involved.
Okay, thank you. This next question gets a lot more sort of into the tenant landlord realm. And so I wanted to ask this question from Matt, who's from Roseville and is an attorney. He says that there are a lot of different ways to view tenant landlord law. One way is to look at a zero-sum game where the gain or loss is felt by is by one or the other. Another is that a landlord tenant law is a balancing act where landlord's interest in the asset is the weight against the tenant's desire to be secure in their home. Another way to think about it is that it's a set of business regulations more than anything, and they need to be predictable, knowable, consistent, and enforced. And another way to view it is that there's this lens of a power imbalance that needs to be corrected at times because sometimes it can be abused. So how do you view the tenant-landlord relationship? What guides your thoughts when you think about that relationship? And we'll start with Representative Hausman.
Oh, I thought you were going to go to
Back and forth between the two, starting off.
because the legal issues, obviously, he's going to be better equipped to.
Well, I guess the question that I'm asking is less about the specific tenant landlord laws, but about how we weigh, is this a business relationship versus having laws that protect tenants to keep them in their housing?
So at all of our hearings where we dealt with tenant protection, we would say over and over and over, most landlords are good. And we just always need to start with that. But there is a power structure. In that tenant landlord relationship, the landlord is in a power position. And so anytime that is the case, I do believe that you have to have protections built in to protect the person who comes in with less power in that relationship. I don't know if that gets it.
It sounds like it's a fine answer to me, definitely. All right, Representative Theis.
As a business person, I would say that we need to really have that relationship. I hear from a lot of the folks in my district that are landlords, that they are working with the folks to make sure that they're getting some kind of a payment. It is a business, so if I don't get enough money to pay for the bills, I can't continue what I'm doing. And that is probably a bigger problem for some of them now, is how do I stay in business and continue to providing the homes. There's also, it also sounds like it's not nobody wants a landlord to make money on anything. But I have to tell you that if I don't make some money, and if I can't put money away, that means that I can't do some of the needed improvements that happen along the way, whether it's a new driveway, new gutters, new appliances, new carpeting. I need to have those resources to do that as well. And the best way that people can keep those costs down are to be good stewards of the properties. And we've had the same 5 tenants for quite a few years, and some of them have been in the properties since we've owned them. We really enjoy our relationships, but I really think that we need to look at it as a joint venture, but yet the landlord is the owner and is responsible for making sure that repairs are done, that things are taken care of. And so I always look at ways, do we allow our landlords the opportunities to do what they need to do in order to keep the house safe and to keep it, well, I guess safe would be the best word to use. Thank you.
I'll ask both of you the same question that sort of weds what was just asked, as well as the earlier question. Minnesota right now has over I think it's about $375 million worth of federal assistance. And just recently, the Treasury released its guidelines, which I have not had the chance to take a look at. I'll fully admit that. But do you see this as an opportunity to make both sides whole? That there's the federal dollars coming in to help renters who have fallen behind or chosen other priorities of what it is they need to afford when they struggle all the time. I'll ask Representative Tice first. I think that's who I would
Mhm.
start. Yep.
Thank you. You know, I was very encouraged when I talked to Commissioner Ho when the proposals came out, because one of the things that was included was really the path line for landlords to help tenants in getting some funds to make sure that they are kept up on their rent and nothing happens. To me, that was a really good partnership. And while it maybe doesn't seem like a big deal, it is a big deal. It makes landlords feel like they are included in making sure they keep their tenants. It's expensive to evict. It's also expensive when somebody moves. We really like to keep our people in place and make sure that, like I said, we can keep everything working well and have a safe environment for them. But having some federal money come in and allowing landlords to help on behalf of the tenants, that's a win-win for me. That is a great idea.
Okay, Representative Hausman.
The needs are very great all across the housing continuum. But having said that, that is a lot of money. And I think well-managed and administered program can do a lot to prevent the damage to both landlords and renters during this time. All of those issues will still be there at the end. Some people at this time of the pandemic say, oh, I just long to go back to normal. I don't. Normal wasn't working. And so I don't want to go back to, I want to learn from this time. How do we apply all of the lessons we're learning to those ongoing issues that were present before? So yes, it's a lot of money. I think we can do a huge amount of good for both keeping tenants and landlords secure. But the problems will still be there at the end.
And as you both know, I have a question to ask about that later on in the questions. But now I want to turn to another one of the questions we had submitted in advance. And Brenda from Duluth asks, what are the plans to pay landlords for the past due rent? And that's probably the answer that we just provided, but I want to ask that once again. What are the plans that we have to pay landlords for past due rent? Is it primarily that it's, yes, Representative Hausman, I'm sorry.
Yes, that first 100 million that we did, we're actually still sending out some of the last checks, but basically that first 100 million, our goal was to have that money go directly to landlords so that we knew that they were held whole. We paid the rent. The tenant applied, but we paid the landlord so that we knew that both sides would be secure. So that's an ongoing process. Okay. First 100 million is spent.
All right, Representative Tice.
I agree with what Chair Hausman said. You know, I think it really was good money, and I think it really worked, because I've been doing some homework on, you know, how we're sitting and what we think evictions will be when we do have an off ramp. And I'm not hearing that we're going to have a big rush on evictions. It'll be pretty much what we've seen before in regular times. So that is very, that makes me feel good, like the money made it to where it should go. And same with mortgages too. I think there's a little bit more thought about those that are owning homes and what happens with their mortgage. I've been talking to bankers and we're not hearing that they have really any issues, or they're really thinking there might be some foreclosures too. To me, that's still a part of the monies that went out, but I know there's a little bit more thought about having folks that have mortgages getting some money too. We just want to keep people in their homes, and I like the numbers. I think that the first 100 million really did what it was supposed to do.
Okay.
To that point, that first 100 million, we had some more freedom to shape that the way we wanted. And we very quickly knew we wanted to protect homeowners too. So we didn't call it rental assistance. We called it housing assistance. Now the vast amount still went to renters just because the problem there is greater, but there were some homeowners that we helped in that first go round.
Anything to add to that, Representative Tice, or is it agreement all around here?
It's agreement. Like I said, we're not I'm not finding numbers that suggest anything, like, I think, well, I think that the money went to where it needed to go, and we're not going to see a big rush. I'm hoping the numbers are right, that we're not going to see a big rush of anything.
I'll move on to Jordan from Cambridge, a social service provider, who is asking, is there any idea when the eviction restrictions will be lifted? And I think we start in this case with Representative Tice.
I think we kind of addressed that right away. And the earliest date would be April 1st, but I'm really thinking we'll see some movement on that. And I know I've heard quite a bit that maybe it might even be this fall. So I think that's where it sits. There isn't any definites as far as I know.
And Representative Hausman?
And the reason there's some uncertainty there is what we don't know yet is whether Dr. Osterholm is right, that there is going to be a second wave this summer, and particularly with the variants. He keeps saying that. He's been a voice alone there, but he has been right about a lot of things in the last year. So I do listen to him, but he's constantly saying that we're not over, there's a second wave coming. If that happens, then all of this is probably going to have to be prolonged a little more. But right now, the numbers are looking very good. The last 3 days, specifically in Minnesota, the numbers look really good.
Okay. So Ruth has a question. I don't have her location. She says, is it possible the state legislature will rule that cities cannot pass by ballot rent control ordinances? Representative Hausman, do you have anything to offer on this?
I do not believe we will be taking any action on that issue. There are a couple of bills, but we're a divided legislature. And on an issue like that, I think there probably would not be agreement between the House and the Senate. And so I do not predict any law changes there.
Representative Tice.
I hope there aren't any law changes, because this is a very different time, and I think we need to see how things pan out before we look at something like that.
Okay, and just to be clear, the question was about the rules changed that cities cannot do ballot measures on rent control. I think you both answered from that perspective,
yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to make that clear.
Yes.
Gabrielle asked a question. It says, my question is for Representative Tice. I work with justice-involved people. I'm assuming that this means people impacted by the criminal justice system, and they have some type of background record who struggle to find places due to affordability and residency restrictions. Do you personally rent to individuals who are justice involved? Why or why not? Perhaps the question asked of Representative Hausman too, if it's revised slightly. Sorry, I'm reading this as it's coming to me. But ensuring that people impacted by the criminal justice system can be securely housed. And maybe since it was addressed to you, we'll ask you first, Representative Tice.
Thank you. We do, and we have for as long as I can remember. And again, I'm going to hit the landlord-tenant relationship when we're talking to folks, and it is something that we talk about. But if they say they have or they are, we ask, tell me what's going on. And in both cases, we're like, okay, I can live with that. And we did, and we're just very happy to do that. One is a family of 3 or 4. And we're just very happy they're doing great. We're just happy to support them.
And since it was reworded for Representative Hausman, I'll also ask you, Representative Tice, just really quickly, do you think that the state has a role in providing any changes to criminal second chance sort of actions for people who do have criminal histories to be dealt with to make sure they have secure housing?
Yes, we have heard a number of bills on expungement. Last year, we didn't have success because we were, as we were negotiating with the Senate, because we're a divided legislature, we're not able to accomplish those. But here is the reason why we can't give up on the possibility of expungement. Whether it's an eviction on your record or a criminal history, when there are lots of people out there looking for rental housing, a landlord, when they do the background checks, it's logical to assume if one person has an eviction record or a criminal record, they've got 6 other people they can rent to. And so we hear enough of those stories about people who literally cannot find a place to rent, that I think we do have to take this seriously. What are our obligations? How long are we going to put them in that position? Years of not being able to find housing.
Representative Tice, anything to add?
I would add that I think I would like to see maybe some, I don't want to say education, but I don't know another word to use for it, but just to have some information to landlords on maybe ways to ask questions or maybe ways to get information and to determine for themselves what's going on. I mean, we've been very open about, you know, you tell me what's going on, I'll work with you. But and we've had some folks who were not good actors. It's just very hard to figure out what to do. Evictions are expensive. I don't want to do that. I just don't. It's very time consuming. It's very expensive. So I don't want that. And, you know, everybody's got situations. We've had times in our lives where our business wasn't doing well and we were really concerned about what was going to happen. Everybody hits those. And I just wish everybody could be open enough to talk about them so that we could avoid some of that and just go forward.
Both of you have talked about how dealing with addressing affordable housing and homelessness are issues that are tied together. There are about, I think, 15,000 people who are homeless any given night, according to the Wilder Research Center. This is a question from me. I think that I want to interject something that I think is being asked in some of the other questions about how to rent to people who aren't always going to get the best shake at things. The Minnesota Housing Partnership a couple of years ago put out a report that said that there's a shortage of 111 affordable and available housing units to low-income households that need them. That's a lot of people who cannot afford the housing that exists in Minnesota. And so if you do have a challenging record, whether it's criminal credit or rental history, you're going to have a difficult time because there's just so little housing available to you for you to be able to manage the situation. Do either of you have solutions or ideas or where you would go to try to find out how to address the situation of people with troubled histories just not being able to have a fair shake at housing these days? And we'll start with Representative Hausman.
Well, I'm going to approach that from a slightly different direction. Where do we put our money? And the phrase that we're all using this year is shelters save lives. Housing ends homelessness. And this year, just because of the cold winter and the amount of people in encampments in the park, I think we had a huge shift in the direction of what do we do about immediate shelters. Some people worried about that. You know, where does most of our money go this year? Because they worried that it would take from the second part of that, and that is increasing the amount of housing available. The one thing that gives me hope is we had a hearing on naturally occurring affordable housing. New construction is expensive. Yes, there's manufactured homes or modular homes, but mostly building new is expensive. So saving naturally occurring affordable housing for that group of people becomes more important than ever. And our NOAA hearing this week, we talked about shifting some of those housing infrastructure bonds to saving naturally occurring affordable housing. But the way we help that group of people is simply to increase the amount of housing that is available to them.
Representative Tice?
I agree with Chair Hausman. I really think that we increase the funding and getting folks into available housing, whether it be rental or owning. We do a better job for everybody. The homes that we have, we bought during the last recession, and got them for pretty cheap. And what the first thing we did was made sure that they were secure and well insulated, took care of, usually we did insulating. Sometimes we did some roofing, put in new windows, doors, things like that to get it safe and as warm as we could. It takes, a little bit of money, but in the long run, it's a better deal for everybody. And I think that's something we could really do a really good service to a lot of folks if we just look at how do we do that. And we had some really good folks that had ideas about that in the last week or so.
And so I'm hearing some agreement here on possibly that bonding dollars being used for naturally occurring affordable housing could be a good use of funds.
There was openness to that.
Okay. And the same from you, Representative Tice?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. We have an anonymous question that's coming from, it looks like it's from a landlord to the representatives. We have several tenants who are not paying the rent. Others have lived in the property with them, not following lease rules or no trampolines or junk in the yard. Unregistered vehicles, we have no way of getting them to comply with the rules to pay rent. Do lawmakers see this as unfair to landlords, or what help can be provided to resources to give to us? And I'm actually going to first ask Mike to step in because there are some assumptions about what it takes to evict someone who is, and maybe this situation specifically doesn't apply, but I'm wondering, Mike, if you can step in and talk about the exceptions to whether or not you can evict someone from a property first and then turn it over to the representatives.
Sure. There are four main exceptions in the governor's eviction moratorium. The first is if the tenant is seriously endangering others on the property. Next would be if there has been significant property damage caused by the tenant. Then we have an old rule, state statute that covers a tenant not being allowed to have illegal drugs, illegal weapons, prostitution, or stolen property in the rental unit. And the last is if the owner or the owner's immediate family member needs to move in to the rental unit and will do so within 7 days of the tenant vacating. So those are the exceptions that are on the books at present. They've been there since August. We're actually in the third version of the governor's moratorium. There were a couple tweaks, and this is the one we've had, like I said, since early August. So I'm not sure, looking at that question, if any of those issues that the landlord seemed to list there would fall in. But it might be correct. They might not be able to evict for any of those reasons.
Yep. Okay. So in reading it, I realized that I haven't captured it wasn't talking about destruction of property, but instead sort of what the property looked like on the outside and what it had there. So the question of the lawmakers is this unfair to landlords, and what resources, what help and resources will they give to us to handle the situation? And I think it begins with Representative Tice.
It's a very interesting question. And as a landlord, it is very hard to, I would say, feel like I have got an opportunity to handle the situation like I feel I should be able to. We always ask folks to, if you have somebody move in, please ask us first, let us approve it. And it doesn't seem like that works very well. It just seems like people just move in. And that's really, when you look at insurance liability wise, that's a big deal. I don't know who's there. So if somebody gets hurt, I don't know who's there. And I don't know why they're there and how long they've been there. But the destruction part of it too, sometimes folks just don't pay attention to that. And that is really where the obligations and what the landlord has to fix and take care of is very hard. You're not getting the extra money. I can't just raise rent. So it's really almost a not a win-win situation at all. It's very hard. We really like the dialogue beforehand so that we know what's going on and what we expect and what we don't expect. I would expect that if there's some trampoline that's put up, I definitely want to be able to have a decision in that, because again, here we are, what if somebody gets hurt and I don't know who that somebody is? So it's always that tricky situation. And there are extra costs that come with having extra folks in the home. When we set our rent, we look at what we figure our water will be, garbage. Those are things that we also take care of that are included in the rent. And I think I should be able to know who's there, why they're there, how long they're going to be there, and are they going to contribute anything? Because there are extra costs included in that. I don't know if that's a super great answer, but it's one of those questions that's really hard to answer. I don't think it's right that when you have a lease and this is our agreement, that somebody breaks it without any notification whatsoever. I have an issue with that.
Okay, Representative Hausman.
So I'll frame this as a question to your attorney. Right now, we're working with a group of people on the role of mediation. Should we be funding mediation? Should it be playing a bigger role? I mean, in a sense, that's another tool. But when I hear this particular situation that you described, one would like to think that there is a place that the landlord and or tenant, when there's that disagreement that has a few gray lines, is there a state-funded mediation process that could help them get to a better place? So that's just an inquiry, I guess. Is there a role that we in the state could provide mediation for an issue like that? Because the other place we have is housing court, but that's an expensive proposition and too far down the line.
Right. I think what the question is asking is now specific, because housing court doesn't do a landlord a lot of good with this kind of situation currently, because housing court's not really available to them because they can't really file an eviction. The best argument I think a landlord can make would be what Representative Tice just mentioned, which is the trampoline. Is that seriously endangering others on the property? Now, a landlord's insurance company might say, well, yes, it is. Absolutely. Look at these stats. And so that would be the landlord's best argument there. But as far as could mediation help solve this? Sure. I think a mediator could come in and say, hey, you know what? You've listed 5 things. The trampoline is the one that's really getting the landlord in trouble with the insurance company. And so we want to get the trampoline out of there. The insurance company doesn't care that there's junk in the yards or unregistered vehicles, but they really care about the trampoline. So there's a way to make this more palatable for that landlord, even though they're not going to be satisfied with the whole answer. Because right now they can't file an eviction for, certainly not for junk in the yard or for unregistered vehicles. Those just don't rise to the exceptions in the governor's moratorium. Like I said, the trampoline one is the only one that works. But first, I don't know anybody that has a trampoline out right now. It's like the wrong time of the year, but maybe I'm wrong. But anyhow, that would be the only place I think that have any footing. Mediation absolutely can play a role. If there's going to be mediation, just to be clear, when it works in the landlord-tenant world is before the landlord files the eviction. Once the landlord has filed the eviction, they've already put in the money, at a minimum $300 just to file the case. Maybe they hired an attorney. Not every landlord hires an attorney, but many of them do. And the tenant is already impacted as well, because the eviction, the minute it's filed, it's on their record. So both sides have a lot more to gain if mediation is going to happen before the eviction is filed.
Before the eviction, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. I have a question that I'm going to want to get in here in a couple, but we are getting a lot of questions from folks. Kimberly, who appears to be a landlord, says, regarding the rental assistance coming, we have tenants who are telling us that they are withholding the rent so that then when the aid is available, they can get the assistance to cover the rent, and they can use the money for other things they own and need to address. Any response to that, Representative Hausman?
Well, that's why this first 100 million, we specifically, in the way we structured it, had money going directly to landlords, so that we could be assured that that rents were in fact paid and that there wasn't going to be a cliff to fall off of at the end of that time. So I think that in terms of how you administer that program, that would be a way of assuring that that happens.
And I agree with Chair Hausman, but I also think that this is where the dialogue comes in. So maybe you could say, okay, just pay a certain percentage and then we'll catch up when the money comes in, so that neither one is left without anything in order to keep going.
I'm going to ask there isn't a gap in here, but I want to make sure that I get this question asked. And I'm going to set a bit of a context. There's the question about how, and Representative Hausman, you made reference to, we can't just come back to now, the normal times now are not working for everybody. And the House Select Committee on Racial Justice did a report to the legislature. And in the report, there's this paragraph on page 14 that says, access to safe and affordable housing is the foundation to a healthy life. In the United States and in Minnesota, housing has also been a foundation for racism, discrimination, and exclusion. There's a historical record of discriminatory displacement in Minnesota, and the legacies of those forced removals are felt in present day. The forced removal of Dakota people in 1851, the destruction of immigrant communities on the Riverside Flats in the 1960s, the displacement of upper middle class and working class Black Minnesotans in the Rondo community with the construction of Interstate 94 are just a few examples. At one point in households faced, at one point, in Minnesota's history, Black residents had high homeownership rates. Unfortunately, these households have faced government-sanctioned displacement from their neighborhoods and counter-redlining policies, and had to contend with discriminatory practices and policies that limit their opportunities for their housing opportunities. And so, a question that I sent to you that addressed this, I'm scrolling down, I'm not seeing it, is how can we make, here it is. How can we make sure that that the state, how do we make sure that state and federal resources not return us to normalcy or of before, but instead address some of the inequities baked into Minnesota's housing economy? And I know that was a long question, but I want to make sure that we point out that there's report regarding addressing inequities did come out, and there's a report to the legislature. Representative Tice, do you have a reaction to that you'd like to share?
From the St. Cloud area, I don't know as much about some of the instances that are referenced there. So I kind of feel a little bit like I'm not really sure. But I would say that in St. Cloud, working with a lot of different folks, I think we're doing a really good job with education. I think we're doing a really good job with folks knowing each other. I think we've had some wonderful opportunities. We've worked with, in our rentals, we've worked with so many different people, and it's such a learning experience to hear about the different life journeys. And we just really appreciate providing a safe place for folks. And I'm not really sure that I'm seeing as much of that as what was referenced. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Maybe I'm sorry.
I'll jump in and then maybe we can have a back and forth response. Home ownership is where we build wealth. We know that. But that report, and I don't have the numbers in my mind yet, the discrepancy between rate, it was something like the white population, I mean, home ownership was something like 85 to 90%. I mean, it was huge. So the gap there is huge. And as a result, if home ownership is where you build wealth, that means all of the issues around poverty are going to also fall more heavily on some of those other categories of people. Right now, we are hearing the reality of what happened in the Rondo neighborhood. And my understanding is it was something like 300 homes And these were naturally occurring affordable housing, the housing stock that was perfect, all owned by people in that community. They were torn down. 300 homes were torn down, naturally occurring affordable housing. All of those individuals had nowhere else to go where they could afford housing. That, I mean, that point in history and a defining moment and its impact on the Black community in St. Paul is a demonstration, I think, of what that question is trying to get at. But it's why we don't give up. We've got to turn some of that around. Representative Herr, who's a newer member in representing the neighborhood of St. Paul, maybe some of you have heard her tell her family story. She has told it in committee several times. When her family came to this country, they came with parents who were educated and therefore could qualify for jobs, for example, at 3M, professional jobs. And that meant their salaries were such they could buy a house. And it was a multi-generational family that came here. And because they could buy a house, it meant they built wealth. They could send their children to college. And then Representative Herr tells what all of those children now do. They're all in professional settings. That point at which can you afford a house or not changes just about everything else in your life, what you're able to do. So though we've got to take those gaps seriously, we have got to address them in our policy setting. It's been, I think, particularly because we have the story of Rondo to remind us why we have to redouble our efforts to turn those statistics around.
I'm going to dig down a little bit more on this question just because I think it requires a substantial conversation, and I want to get to more questions. But if you're talking about evictions, it's single mothers, African-American mothers are the ones most deeply impacted by evictions. Homelessness numbers, much greater disproportionate impact on communities of color. Home ownership values, not home ownership rates, but home ownership values for homes that should be valued about the same as what a white family would get as a loan, cannot be achieved by different BIPAC communities. And so I'm again wondering, we have this opportunity where this new federal money has come in. And is there a way for us to use these resources to not return to normal? Is this an opportunity to go beyond normal and into something where we're actually dealing with making things more equitable? And I'm going to ask, it's sort of the same question, but I want to ask again, because I think it's something that this is an opportunity. So Representative Hausman, anything more that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think our conversations with Minnesota Housing as they reshape this program, that first 100 million happened so fast, and it had to go. And because there were deadlines built in, they had to set up the program quickly and get the money out the door. But with this next infusion of money, we have an opportunity, I think, to have a conversation with Minnesota Housing about those kinds of issues. We're already having the conversations, I can tell you, but I don't know that we've done, well, it's certainly been talked about already in our hearings by people testifying and by the department, the agency responding. So we have our work cut out for us, but this is the time when that conversation has to happen.
Representative Tice?
Thank you. You know, we have always worked with our single moms, and I think what we've heard and what Chair Hausman has said, it makes such a difference in their lives and their families when those moms have that security. And I would hope that at some point maybe we can, you know, I hate to say we can just carve out some money for them, but I think it's really worthwhile to see the kids grow up. And like I said, some of these kids have been in the home for 10 years. So we've seen them as toddlers, and now they're teenagers. It's just a joy, and they kind of get to be a part of our family too. But just knowing that they have the security of a home and those opportunities, I think, are well worth it. And I hope that we really do look at, and I love the Alice, I keep forgetting, home for homework or homework for.
Homework
It's another
homework starts at home.
It's a wonderful program too, and it's basically saying kids that are at home do better in school, and that is such a win-win that I can't believe that we don't do more for that. And of course, we could do more for everything, but I think those are the things that I hold dear is, let's help those single moms. Let's get the kids in a home. Let's help her out by, making sure that they're doing well in school and doing great things. I mean, it's just been, like I said, a treat for us to see these kids grow up, and it's just amazing. They're such wonderful kids.
Can I jump in quick, Michael?
Sure, certainly.
Yeah, I was just gonna, since this is slightly related, I was just gonna say two things. We've gotten a couple of questions since both representatives were talking a while back about the original $100 million in CHAP funding, and there's been some questions about what about the plan for the newer $375 million, and who's going to be able to access that? What are the rules and stuff going to be on that? And I'll leave it to either representative to answer if you do have anything. But I did want to just share that again, the guidance on that was just released earlier this week, and that Minnesota Housing and the jurisdictions that are in charge of the $375 million are sort of in the process of finalizing that. And I think there's a community input process that I can share in the chat about that as well. But once it is finally announced, it's our hope, because we did do this back in September or August of last year, to have some folks from Minnesota Housing and maybe other jurisdictions on one of these webinars to discuss it and answer questions in more detail. So that maybe handles that, a couple of the questions that came in. And then the other thing I was going to mention, because you did say something about a hard stop at 3. We're going to try to tackle quite a few more questions here if we can. A lot have come in, but Mike and I will stick around too to answer some of the legal questions after 3 o'clock, since we did get some of those too.
So I guess, should I ask about the 375 million, or is that you dealt with that?
If there's anything more you want to share on it, I just figured I'd.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Rosa asks, I'm going to jump to a different question then. Rosa asked, I'm curious to know if the pre-eviction numbers were acceptable. Again, this is sort of dealing with the old question, the prior question, but is there a standard that we're working to maintain, hoping can make it to a very pointed effort to prevent any evictions during and after COVID? What measures can we take? I think I'm going to ask this question as, what can we do regarding greatly reducing the number of evictions that are taking place in this state?
We have to raise the wages of the lowest paid people. I mean, we have so much of this is caused by income inequality. Of that, 1 in 5 people live in poverty. 1 in 5 people live in poverty, and so we just simply have got to work on an issue like minimum wage. All of those ways in which a vast number of people who simply don't make enough at their job to be able to afford housing. That's a core piece of this.
Representative Theis.
And I would say that we need to really do some headway and make some forward motion into how do we get the cost of housing down. We really need to look at some of the costs that are coming up, some of the fees that are being proposed, and say, you know what, enough is enough. We need to make sure that we are able to supply the homes that we need across the board and do it at a level that people can afford. It's getting to be that the first time, I'm going to call a first time homeowner. So a couple that's just out of college, maybe a couple of years working their job, getting married, they're not able to find homes either. So not only is it just looking for the affordable, it's looking for everything across the board. And we need to figure out how to get that at a more affordable level. So the first time homeowner house isn't $260,000. It should be half of that. So we need to look at why is that happening, and how can we get that to come down again? I'm not saying we're going to get to come down a whole $100,000, but there are ways that we can have it come down substantially.
And to be open to different housing models.
Mhm.
We referenced earlier modular construction. It's a different way to build that is vastly less expensive than typical. But I've also talked about different housing models. For example, tiny houses. We just have a situation in Minneapolis where they're building a tiny house village inside a big warehouse. Rooming houses. My understanding is there's one in Minneapolis where it's the old model, but hopefully new and improved, where everyone has their own bedroom and bathroom, but then they share public spaces. And the other advantage to that is people are living in community. They're not living in isolation. And so as we talk about different housing models, there are some advantages to some of them that I think are worth pursuing.
It's great that we're talking about ownership opportunities. I do want to mention that there are always going to be renters,
Right.
and we need to figure out how to handle situations that they're experiencing as well. And for equity reasons, we need to again find asset building through home ownership. But I'm getting a couple of questions highlighted by staff at Homeline saying you got to ask these, and so I'm going to get to them. First, Leah is asking Representative Tice a question, but I both can answer. You spoke about a lot of things about improving tenant-landlord relationships. How could we make sure this happens on a systemic level? What are concrete steps that we can take to improve the relationships between landlords and tenants across Minnesota?
I think mediation is a great way to do it, but I think, and I talked a little bit about it before, just trying to find some, maybe even webinars on how to go about just having a good relationship with each other. Sometimes I think people are just afraid to say something, and landlords are afraid to ask. But like I said, I think I was talking about maybe the evictions or asking if there's anything on the record. If we can find a way that makes it easy for people to be able to share that information and getting that out there, kind of teaching people how do we communicate. That's probably one of the bigger parts of it is how do we figure out how to get people talking. Mediation is probably a good way to do it. But I think there's ways that we can do it on our own. We just got to figure out how to get it out there and teach people how to ask the questions in a way that shows that you're just really interested in not being invasive.
Representative Hausman, anything to add?
So my understanding is Homeline has some sort of tenant landlord education or training. Is that a model that we could use in a broader way? What's the nature of that? How do they, when are they connected with?
You're participating in what I'm told is near the 50th presentation that we've done, and many of them we've involved tenants and landlords. We've had tenant lawyers and tenant and landlord lawyers present on sort of what are the rules as they are right now. And so yes, some of that education does happen. We also have books on how to be the smartest renter on your block, and also how to be a good landlord in this situation. So we do that education, and we can use this as a future opportunity as well. I did mention, however, that we've had instruction done by tenant lawyers, but also landlord lawyers. And Kim is a landlord attorney here, and she's asking the question: landlords are approaching the 12th month milestone for this eviction moratorium. Is there any landlord relief in the horizon in the form of legislation? For example, is there anything that will help property taxes, insurance, or maintenance? Or those earmarked housing funds intended to be solely for the financial relief? Some are not finding funding available for property owners unless it's connected to a tenant's rent. Any response to that?
Well, I'll take that little paragraph and take it back with me, because since we're just discussing the off-ramp, that would be maybe one of the questions around which we would have some conversation with either the agency or so I'll grab that paragraph and take it back with me.
Okay.
I think property taxes are always kind of one of those things where it's a double-edged sword, because that's our county, basically our county dollars too. our counties have been really great at working with folks, and I know they've done it before with property taxes. So that's a good question, and maybe that's something we need to look at as well, to have some kind of relief, maybe a different deadline, so that we can get those dollars in.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can get this right. Timothy says, it appears that we are at a disconnect regarding what type of landlords we are discussing. It's my understanding that Representative Hausman has more experience with large school commercial landlords of lower income areas, similar to slumlords. Whereas Representative Tice has more experience with hobbyist style landlords who've purchased a second residential unit under speculatory circumstances as a form of supplementary income. If we consolidate the disconnect, I believe we'd have a better question. Should we be more concerned about the lack of personal relationships with commercial landlords abusing their power versus single dwelling landlords, I believe that Representative Tice is referencing? There's a question there, but it's sort of buried in a lot of editorial remarks. And living near your district, Representative Hausman, I don't know that the classification of the landlords you deal with fit that classification or not. But Representative Hausman, do you have an answer to the question that Timothy is asking?
Well, I think maybe where that perception comes from is what we're talking about when we talk about tenant protection. What we're addressing is when things go wrong. Mostly, I started by saying, hopefully mostly things go right. But when they go wrong, what protections have to be in place? So I think the perception there comes from, I have spent most of my time talking about what happens, what is our obligation when things go wrong? What kinds of protections do we have to build in?
Representative Tice?
You know, it's a really good question. My experience is with the single, having single family homes, and but I have a lot of friends in the community who own the bigger buildings, and I know that just talking to them, they are very interested in making sure that who's ever managing the apartments or whoever's taking care of it kind of know who's living there and the tenants. So, and maybe it's just we don't have as many bigger units in St. Cloud. So I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing things out there. I don't know for sure what the difference would be, but we're seeing a lot of the people I know are really interested in making sure. When I talked to one gentleman who was having a couple issues with getting some rent, he knew them and talked to them personally, even though he does have managers there. So I think there are times when they are engaged, and I'm hoping that they feel comfortable enough to do that. The landlords feel comfortable enough to have that personal relationship, to call folks when there's an issue, rather than just having somebody else sometimes handle it. That's always my hope, is that there's a better way to do it personally than just, let's just say our relationship is done and we're going to evict. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. So I look for those relationships.
We have two related questions to the off-ramp from Kelly and Catherine. Kelly asks, you talked about an off-ramp from the eviction moratorium. Other experts in Minnesota have warned about a tsunami of evictions. What do you see as the appropriate steps to take to ensure the courts don't become overwhelmed when the eviction moratorium ends? And Hennepin County is one example where, if there currently are far too many evictions that are happening, and I don't know if I imagine that both of you a little bit more removed from the Hennepin County situation, but a lot of work has to happen between tenant referees, where they go to the judge with a resolution that's come out of the negotiations. But it's also sort of a sea of people sort of cramped together, making these deals in a very short period of time, that it's very difficult to have good negotiations happening when right next to you, there's another family going through the same incidents. So the question was if you see appropriate steps to ensure that the courts don't become overwhelmed, even more than they currently are, I would say, when the eviction moratorium ends. Representative Theis.
One of the things that I hope we do is, and maybe that comes from some of the money that could be available on the federal level, seeing if we can't extend some folks who are trying to do the right thing. I don't want to see a plethora of evictions. I don't think anybody wins there. But like you said, there's probably too many anyway. So I think it's just going to be a really long process, but I'm hoping that some of the money helps smooth it over until some of the issues get settled. If it's just for non-payment of rent, maybe we can catch some folks up and keep them where they're at. I think that would be my hope.
So the eviction off-ramp being done in stages.
Correct.
Okay. Representative Hausman.
So the good news is that we are not in this work alone. The amount of advocacy groups, partners that we have, the Homes for All Coalition, for example, something like 293 groups are now part of that. And some of them have been excellent about doing the work that person is asking about, doing the study out in the community and around the state to give us some sense of the unmet need. And we've had a number of those groups in testifying. And so I'm thinking that as part of this discussion of the off-ramp, we'll revisit with some of those groups what statistical work they've done and how close are they to giving us some sense of how big the problem is going to be.
Sort of on that note, realizing that there's more information that's needed, Catherine is asking, could you please provide information about what's being considered by the legislature for what an off-ramp actually looks like?
Well, it's sort of being written and revised as we speak. We have not yet had the hearing on it. So in the next couple of weeks, I'm guessing that you'll see posted a hearing specifically to discuss the bill that defines the off-ramp. So we're close to knowing what that's going to look like.
Representative Theis.
And I would agree with that. I mean, we really don't have any idea at this point for sure until we start seeing some bills.
Okay. Let's see. This is possibly a tenant, to Jay, I believe. Why is the additional cost of water, trash, and maybe other costs and fees on top of rent happening in applying for more, and applying for an apartment? An apartment rent can increase over time. The more rental can't afford the extra cost. I'm going to take this as actually, I'm not certain if the question is asking this, but it's a particular piece of Homeline's legislation actually that we've proposed is that sometimes there are additional non-optional fees that are thrown on top of your rent, so that when you go to apply for it, you think you're going to rent at a certain level. You've just put down your application fees. You've found the unit that you want, and then after that, you're confronted with these additional expenses that are for non-optional things. Homeline has a proposal that would say that those hidden fees just be wrapped into what the rent is, so that there's transparency in how much it's actually going to cost. And I want to ask you first, Representative Hausman, is that something that you would find favorable, a favorable approach to these additional costs, or would you take a different approach?
Well, interestingly, that was a hearing we had where we were hearing some of these stories, like one fee that's just a January fee. You charge the fee because it's January, or you are charged a fee in order to pay your rent. Whenever we have these hearings and start to hear about these stories, it's always an education for us. But clearly that bill is one that we obviously have an interest in.
Representative Theis, you were in that committee hearing as well and heard that proposal. There was actually a couple things that were in that bill, but is this thing about making the rent actually what the rent, the full transparency and what it's going to cost to actually rent an apartment, something that you would find favorable?
I do. For, we don't do that with our homes. Like I said, we have one of our homes is having a lot of extra water usage numbers. And so we're at a point now where it's like we need to have a discussion with them to figure out what we're going to do. But also, as somebody who rents an apartment here, I don't have any additional fees on top of what is laid out in my lease. And that's the way it should be. There should be no additional fees other than what's laid out in the lease. So I would look to find out why this is being done. I don't understand it.
Okay. We have an anonymous question saying Minnesota has become a land of 10,000 disparities. Do you have thoughts about how those unaware at activities at the Hill be brought on board regarding housing as a quality of life issue? We can house our own workforce or stop being a state of people who stop being a state people want to call home. The wording on this question is a little hard to follow. I'm uncertain if they're saying that there are a lot of disparities that we have to address and that home is a quality of life issue, or if it's being asked from a different perspective. Any response to that, or should I move on to the next question?
Well, I would just say, I mean, the premise is that the first sentence that I started with, nothing else in life goes well if you don't have a safe place to sleep at night. So from that perspective, you have to take care of that basic need first before you can work on everything else. And so if there are disparities and that reality, the lack of housing falls more heavily on one group of people than another, that's a problem for us as a society. I think we have to be willing to name that, face it and name it. I don't know if that's what the questioner was trying to get at.
Okay, I need to say that I've not been following the time, and we need to make sure that we thank you for devoting the time that we have actually taken quite some time.
Yes.
We're gonna have Mike and Eric stick around for questions that are more legal in nature. So folks, please stay on. But I want to thank both of you for being here, for offering your viewpoints on rental housing, and for answering some questions from the community that are pressing issues for them. We deeply appreciate it. And I deeply appreciate the role that you play at the legislature in helping work through how to make home a possibility and a stable place, a quality housing for everybody involved. So thank you. On any last words you just want to put in before we close?
Just thank you for the invitation.
Okay,
Good to be part of the
Representative Theis.
conversation.
Same here. Thank you, Michael. I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of notes. So
Thank you, Representative Theis.
always a good day.
All right. Good day to both of you. All right.
Thank you very much to both of you. Yes.
Bye.
We got a ton of questions. We weren't able to get to everything, and we were trying to navigate through all of them. But hopefully, the representatives were able to cover quite a bit. We do have a number of questions. Are you looking at them, Mike?
I am, but I'm not sure where you're looking. They come in multiple waves. So just go ahead and start asking and then check them off when we get done.
Okay, so we did get legal questions that came in, so we'll stick around for a little bit longer here and try to answer some of those. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to put up the information about our next seminar. Again, it's 2 weeks from today, and it'll cover any updates in the eviction suspension, but we're going to do a deep dive about the new ordinances in St. Paul that will go into effect on March 1st. So Margaret Kaplan from Housing Justice Center, who's been on the city implementation team, along with a group of community members, landlords, others, will be our guest.
And many folks have signed off already, and that's fine. We promised a couple of representatives and they delivered for a solid 90 minutes. We're going to try to answer questions we can about more traditional types of questions that we get on these sessions, which is what are the rules are and how do they apply to my situation? So we'll try to do that as well as we can over the next half hour or so.
Yeah, so seeing Gabrielle's question, when is the rent considered paid? When the renter has sent the payment electronically, or when the landlord has received it for electronic payments?
Oh, I'm not sure I know the precise answer to that. I don't really practice in what we call UCC stuff, but checks are the traditional way that payments are made. And so probably with the electronic form, in general, it's going to be when it's sent. Usually there's documentation of some type. It might be when it's available to the landlord, but most judges, if it comes down to it, are going to say, hey, look, when it was sent electronically, that's when it's no longer in the tenant's possession. They can't somehow retract it or withdraw the money back. It's winding its way there electronically, which is typically pretty instantaneous these days. So usually the answer is going to be when the payment is made, but it's going to be somewhat fact specific on the type of payment and everything.
Right. Trish is asking if a tenant's moving out but still owes rent on the day of the move out, can they be evicted after the moratorium is lifted? She added, tenant has a lease up, but upon move out still owes past due rent. Can they be evicted after the moratorium, even if they don't live there anymore? Or would that be sent to collection agency?
So it's a good question, Trish. No, an eviction is not the proper remedy for a landlord in that situation. In fact, a landlord would have to commit perjury to file an eviction in that situation. Here's why. When a landlord files an eviction is the court case, the unlawful detainer, the UD, where the landlord pays the $300. When the landlord files the eviction, they have to swear under oath on the court form that the tenant is still in possession of the property. Evictions are designed to figure out who gets the keys to the place. The landlord already has the keys. The tenant has left. Maybe they owed a bunch of money, but they left. So the landlord's remedies at this point, usually one of two that they choose. Either to chase the tenant through court, conciliation court, small claims court, where a landlord can sue up to $15,000 in Minnesota, or turn it over to a collection agency if they think it's worth that time and effort for them to put into it. Collection agencies can try to get somebody to pay a debt that they owe and impact their credit if they don't. Just as a court judgment has a huge impact on somebody's credit if it's not paid off, if the tenant were to lose that case. But no to the eviction. A landlord can't file an eviction once they have possession of the place, or more precisely, once the tenant has yielded possession of the rental.
Right. Michael, I think in Minneapolis, maybe that's, so this might have something to do with the Minneapolis ordinances that we've talked about in the past. A tenant wants to move, it sounds like a landlord, questions from the landlord. Tenant wants to move a friend in, and the friend has past felonies that are less than 7 years old, and had been incarcerated previously. Not really left to question, but I think maybe the answer is simply if you are in Minneapolis and then soon on March 1st in St. Paul, there are some regulations regarding tenant screening.
And I'm not sure if you're able to post a link to the Minneapolis version of that. Eric, it might take a little hunting to get that, so you can post it in the chat. Yeah, we've entered a new era of landlord-tenant law in this state in the last couple of years. I think we've actually written a couple of books on landlord-tenant law. Michael talked about them earlier in the session. And if and when we write another one, we're going to have a brand new chapter that didn't exist in either one of those previous books about the rise of city laws. Cities are passing ordinances, and Minneapolis and St. Paul are sort of at the fore of that, although they're not the only ones. In Minneapolis, the question we're getting asked about has limited what a landlord can look at from somebody's past. It's not just criminal record, it's credit, it's rental history. So it's a lot, the answer is a lot more, there's a lot more to the answer than there is to the question/statement that we got. And in each city, a landlord is probably gonna have to figure out what the rules are. And so in Minneapolis, there is a specific set of new rules that Eric has just posted a link to. And that's why we're talking about the St. Paul ordinance, which is similar, very similar to the Minneapolis ordinance in this regard next week, 2 weeks from now, as the new ordinance goes into effect on March 1 in St. Paul.
Yeah, okay. If a landlord's property is not in a county, that is not providing any sort of landlord or rental assistance, can the landlord make a claim on non-payment tenant's behalf? Sometimes we have to.
I'm sorry, so the landlord, do you think the landlord is asking, can they cross county lines to ask for money?
I'm not sure. I think, I mean, we can answer that. Well, you can't, I mean, you can't evict for non-payment. You know, you
got to be in the county where the property is located to file an eviction.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And then
as far as suing for, well, This isn't about a suing question, but I can give the answer for suing somebody. If you want to sue somebody in Minnesota, you could sue them where the defendant lives as well. So if the tenant had moved to another county, then they could be sued in that other county. But as far as trying to qualify for money, I'm not sure what the question, maybe they're trying to chase a tenant for money that has left the unit, and so they're no longer in the county. Will the county come up with money? I'm not sure if the money's going to be county by county allocated or if it's going to be state allocated. It'll depend, I think.
Yeah, again, we don't know if this is a current program or not, but again, as soon as there's more details about the state program, which our understanding is that there may be some, either through counties or through the state, there may be some process that landlords can apply on behalf of tenants, then we'll include that in one of our future seminars. Okay, let's see here. Carrie asked, my readings of the executive orders lead me to believe, oh, is there, just generally, is this an attorney for a landlord? Is there a ban on rental increases? Reading of the executive orders lead me to believe increases have not been prohibited, only that there's no evictions for non-payment. But had some people argue that there is a moratorium on increases in rent. The only place I've been able to find this is stated from Housing Link. It said Minnesota Multi-Housing Association recommended that at some point. Have not found this statement on their website. Are Minnesota rental housing providers prohibited from increasing rents to help defer increasing city and maintenance costs during the pandemic?
So a couple answers here. First of all, the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association recommendations that were issued actually before the governor's eviction moratorium way back in March were never binding on anybody. They were just recommendations. And so I've seen people cite them as if they had some sort of legal effect, but they don't. They never have. There is a price gouging cap that is an executive order derived rule in Minnesota since the pandemic began that covers all kinds of goods and services where the price can't be more than 20% what it was, I think, a month before the original peacetime emergency was put in place. So any rent increase that exceeds 20% would be something governable by that 20% price gouging limit. I talked to a tenant earlier this week that had a rent increase that was above the 20%. I referred them to the Attorney General's office, which is the sole agency for enforcing the governor's executive orders on the evictions and price gouging, among others.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that came in about, I think, the family exception. So I'm gonna ask all the questions and or I'm gonna
all the family questions first. Okay.
Yeah, and maybe just generally you can answer all these. Hopefully, can somebody explain further details regarding giving a tenant 30 days notice that a relative needs to move in? What's the definition of relative? Can it be a cousin, cousin's adult child? Is there a minimum time they have to live there? Any other details to know? This particular person provides rent assistance in certain counties and are hearing from tenants that private landlords are wanting to move back into the house. So they've been given 30-day notices. Is this a loophole? In a couple instances, the owner didn't re-rent the property and did not move back in. Is that legal? And then we have an attorney a landlord asking kind of the same question. What is a relative definition in the eyes of the law? Is there a minimum time? Yeah.
Yeah. So, a couple of weeks ago, our office met with some people from an agency called Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, the landlord trade group. And we were talking about proposed legislation, both that landlords were interested in and that tenants were interested in, seeing if there was any middle ground anywhere. But one of the things that we agreed on, which doesn't happen much in those conversations, sometimes, I mean, they're collegial conversations, but there was an agreement on the executive orders that the governor had issued about how they just needed to be a little better than they are. The family exception is, I think, one of the giant weak links of the current eviction moratorium that we have. If I would have been asked, and our office wasn't, nor were landlord groups asked, I think the governor was trying to do this independently as much as they possibly could. We would have said, hey, look, if you're going to have a family member exception, you should really define what a family is. What is a family member for the purposes of this exception? We don't know. It's really vague in the executive order, just as family member. And there are hosts of other ordinances statutes, both at the state and federal level, that will literally define what a family member is. And sometimes it's, spouse, kids, parents, and that's it. Sometimes it's grandparents, grandchildren. Sometimes it'll be cousins out to, however far they want to go, but it's not defined. So family members are not defined. I will say that the Attorney General's office, this was in the news last week, is going after an Apple Valley landlord that seemed to be abusing, according to what's in the Strib, the family member exception, where they told somebody to leave. And again, not our case, just what I saw in the newspaper. The landlord sold the place to somebody else and never took possession themselves. The family member exception requires two things. Number one, that there is a need for the owner or their family member to move in. So there has to be some story, at least there, for the landlord to be able to convince a judge, if this goes in front of a judge later and the penalty is pretty substantial, that they had a need, or their family member had a need to move in. And secondly, that the family member, once the tenant has vacated, has moved in within 7 days of the tenant vacating, sort of to demonstrate the need. That didn't happen in the Apple Valley case, according to the media reports. Additionally, a landlord has to give a notice as well, at least 7 days, which is something not found in the law otherwise, but longer if there's a notice period that's longer. So if the tenant is on a month-to-month lease, I think the landlord has to give probably a full rental period's notice in order to activate the family member exception. But I wish there was a lot more clarity in that specific clause of the governor's executive order, because it would just answer a lot of these questions so people wouldn't need to ask them. It doesn't bother me that you're asking them. It's just that we should be able to follow the laws, and that one's pretty hard to follow, to understand.
Yeah, so another couple sets that I'm going to try to stick together here of questions sort of related to significant substantial damage. So one example is from Rachel, that where the lease says it's a single family home, tenant pays, there's a verbal agreement about tenant paying utilities, tenant didn't fill the LP tank, pipes burst, city shut off water, places maybe becomes uninhabitable. Can a landlord terminate a lease when there's significant damage to the property? Well, this is asking not due to tenant's negligence. There's no water to the home and no way to flush toilets. Can landlord evict based on causing significant damage to property? There's other questions just generally insight about things like animals and damage to property. And just, is there any sort of red line rule limit dollar amount to meet the criteria around substantial property damage?
Yeah, and actually the right word is significant. That's the one that's referenced in the executive order. And I think you were interchanging that with serious. There's no dollar bright line differentiator, which is something that means it's up to the judge or the referee to determine what significant property damage would be. But yeah, a landlord can file an eviction for significant property damage caused by the tenants. And then the question with the issue that we're talking about is the tenant, did they cause the significant property damage? And it's really fact specific. If this is a tenant or somebody working with tenants, I'd want them to call our free tenant hotline or send a email to our free email and attorney service so we can dive in to try to figure it out. But that would be where the landlord would file the eviction if they were going to file one here, is for the significant property damage. The question would be, can they prove that it was caused by the tenant? And that's kind of a fact specific question.
Couple more questions. There's still 90 or so people hanging on. Are you good?
Oh, I'm fine. Keep going. I'm not just going to walk out. I'm in my basement. Where am I going to go?
You drop the mic and you walk.
Okay.
Carrie asks, has there been any information regarding what qualifies as the 7-day notice prior to an eviction under the stated exceptions? Does email/USPS postal service sufficient? Certified mail required?
Yeah, I don't think that that's required at all. I don't think it says I haven't had that question in all this time since August that we've been doing this. So I'm going to pull it up and make sure that I'm not giving the wrong answer. But I don't recall anything about the method for giving the 7-day notice, but I'll just pull it up and make sure because there's no sense in guessing about this.
So this is
Written notice. That's it.
2079. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at Executive Order 20-79, and this is number 6. Written notice is the requirement that we have. So I think telling somebody isn't enough. Telling them over the phone, telling them in person isn't enough. It's got to be something in writing. If I were advising a landlord, I'd want something that's, showable to a judge, obviously. Texts traditionally are the least judicially accepted way to give some kind of notice. Next up would be something like an email. Actual piece of paper signed by somebody and handed to another one is going to be better. It doesn't have to be sent by mail. It certainly doesn't have to be sent by certified mail. Anything that requires certified mailing, we'll say that in the statute somewhere. They don't want you to have to guess about that. So less than certified mail. Is a text enough? I don't think so. Is an email enough? Maybe if you have a long-term email relationship, but I wouldn't do it if I were a landlord. I'd actually use a piece of paper. That's the most conservative advice I can give on that.
Yeah, then there's a question it's kind of a follow-up to the a question that I did ask the representatives about, sort of like additional fees and those types of things. So this tenant is giving an example. Rent is $1,200. Late fee is another $45, and then they have to pay a percentage of water, heat, trash, sewage, additional monthly utility costs, and so that can be expensive. Can the landlord charge all those, include them in the lease, and charge all of those?
Yeah, I mean, they probably can. We were sort of talking on different tracks earlier with the representatives about fees and things like that. So can a fee be put into a lease? Almost certainly. The way the law sits right now, a landlord can put virtually any fee that they want. Representative Hausman mentioned a January fee. That's not a made up fee. There's a big landlord in the Twin Cities area that charges every year, annually, a $100 January fee. And again, why? Because it's January. So we're going to charge a $100 January fee. Our concern with that kind of fee is that it's the kind of thing that isn't disclosed when a tenant is shopping. If you look for a rental, chances are what you're going to do is you're going to say, I want to live in one of these 5 cities, this geographic area. And if you're on Craigslist or Housing Link or anything like that, you're going to set a range, a dollar range that you can shop in. And so if a place is $9.99, for instance, we'll just use that. You're going to find it if you're entering a search and you say under $1,000. But if there's a January fee of $100, your rent isn't actually $9.99. It's actually about $1,009 every month. A little bit less than that, but it's about $1,009 every month. Not $99 or not $9.99. It's, in my mind, it's a deceptive way to lure somebody in. It's a bait and switch. And so what the proposed legislation that is saying that no non-optional fees can be charged, it allows a landlord to charge extra for an optional garage spot, because not every tenant wants a garage spot or a parking space. But if it's something that you don't have any choice about as far as the fee goes, it should be included in the rent. So a tenant has more transparency in what they're going to be paying. Also, I think it affects something like the CRP, the credit for rent paid. The tenant can only use money that they paid for rent. They won't be able to use a January fee as something that they can claim as something they should get credit for in a CRP analysis. I'm not sure. Was that answering the question, do you think? Or maybe it wasn't, but.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think that's, I may have missed stuff. We had a lot of questions come in, and some of them were more targeted for the
But
legislators.
they came in different places too.
Yeah, so I think we've captured most of them. So I guess I think we'll call it a day. Just a reminder, I did put in the chat a link to the registration for our event 2 weeks from now. And again, is the topic's going to be on partially on the section, or sorry, the new ordinances that go into effect in the city of St. Paul on March 1st. But we'll also talk about updates on any news on the suspension. We're hoping later in March to then also have another session where hopefully by then there'll be some announcement about the new rental assistance programs, and we'll have more to share on that and maybe a guest. So thanks for joining us today. And thanks for submitting your questions, and we'll call that a day. Thank you.